Suffering doesn't arrive by itself. We feed it without knowing. Suffering does not knock on the door and ask permission. It does not arrive with noise or ceremony. Most often, it slips into the room quietly, already familiar, already wearing our own face. We wake up with it in the chest, a faint tightness. We carry it into the day like a second spine. We call it stress, responsibility, personality, fate. We tell ourselves this is just how life is, and so it stays. There is a deep misunderstanding at the heart of our pain. We believe suffering comes from outside, from other people, from circumstances, from a world that refuses to bend to our hopes. But when we look more closely, with patience rather than judgment, another truth begins to reveal itself. Suffering does not arrive by itself. It is invited, it is fed, often by hands that do not know what they are doing. This is not said to accuse or to shame. It is said to return dignity to where it belongs. For if suffering were entirely imposed upon us, then we would be helpless before it. But if suffering is sustained by habits of mind, by unconscious reactions, by small daily clinging, then there is also a way to stop feeding it. There is a way to let it starve, gently, without violence. This reflection is not about fixing your life. It is not about becoming better, purer, calmer, or more spiritual. It is about seeing clearly, and in seeing clearly, loosening the knots that have been tied again and again in the same places. Imagine sitting by a fire at night, the forest breathing around you, no rush, no demand, just warmth, darkness, and attention. What is offered here is not instruction, but companionship. A voice walking beside you, pointing not to distant ideals, but to what is already happening right now in this very moment of being human. Suffering often begins long before pain is felt. It begins in the moment we lean forward mentally, reaching for something that is not here yet. It begins when the mind leaves the simplicity of this breath, this body, this sound, and starts negotiating with imagined futures and rehearsed pasts. Nothing dramatic happens at first, just a subtle departure, just a small forgetting. A thought arises. This should be different. Another follows. I should be different. The body tightens slightly, as if preparing to defend itself against something unseen. The world has not changed, but our relationship to it has. This is the first feeding. Desire is not always loud. Sometimes it is a whisper disguised as motivation, ambition, or care. It says, if only this were secure, if only that were resolved, then I could rest. And so rest is postponed. Peace becomes conditional. Life is reduced to a waiting room. Aversion works in the same quiet way. A sound irritates us. A memory disturbs us. A person challenges the image we hold of ourselves. Without noticing, we push away the experience, tightening around it, resisting what is already here. This resistance does not remove the discomfort. It multiplies it. Pain becomes suffering when it is argued with. We rarely notice these movements because they feel so personal, so justified. The mind says, of course I am upset. Look at what happened. Of course I am anxious. Look at what might happen. Of course I am dissatisfied. Look at how things are. Each explanation feels reasonable. Each reaction feels necessary. And so the cycle continues, unquestioned. The Buddha spoke of suffering not as a punishment, but as a pattern that can be observed, a pattern that arises due to conditions. And what arises due to conditions can also cease when those conditions are no longer sustained. One of the most overlooked conditions is identification. The moment we say, this is happening to me, something solidifies. A fluid experience becomes a personal story, Sensation becomes narrative. Feeling becomes identity. Sadness arises, and instead of allowing sadness, the mind says, I am sad. Anger arises, and instead of feeling heat and contraction, the mind says, I am angry. Fear arises, and instead of trembling awareness, the mind says, I am afraid. This subtle shift is powerful. It turns passing weather into permanent climate. It turns experience into self. When experience is allowed to be just experience, it moves. When it is claimed, it stays. Ownership is the glue that holds suffering in place. Consider how often the mind returns to old wounds, replaying conversations, reimagining outcomes, sharpening grievances that no longer exist in the present moment. Each return feels like seeking resolution, but often it is only repetition. The fire is no longer burning on its own. We keep adding fuel. This feeding happens not only in pain, but in pleasure as well. We cling to good moments, fearing their end. We measure ourselves against past happiness, against others' lives, against imagined ideals. Joy becomes anxious. Contentment becomes fragile. Impermanence is not the enemy. Resistance to impermanence is. Everything that arises will pass. This is not philosophy, it is observation. Breath passes, sound passes, thought passes. Even the most intense emotion, when met without interference, moves like a wave. But when we demand that what is pleasant remain, or that what is unpleasant disappear immediately, we create tension. We demand permanence from what cannot provide it. And so suffering grows, not because life is cruel, but because the mind insists on contracts reality never signed. To see this is not to become passive or indifferent. It is to become intimate with how suffering is constructed, moment by moment. Not in theory, but in the body, in the jaw that clenches, in the stomach that tightens, in the breath that shortens. Awareness begins here, not in grand insights, but in simple noticing. Noticing without commentary, noticing without the urge to correct. This is the beginning of not feeding suffering. The mind is a builder. It constructs meaning, identity, and continuity. This ability allows us to navigate the world, to remember, to plan, to care. But when unexamined, the same builder becomes an architect of prisons. One of the most elaborate structures it builds is the sense of a solid self, a self that must be protected, improved, validated, and defended. A self that feels incomplete, and therefore always reach. This self is not something we consciously invent. It forms gradually, through memory, comparison, praise, blame, success, failure. It feels real because it is constantly referenced. But when looked for directly in sensation, in thought, in feeling, it cannot be found as a fixed entity. There is experience, but no owner separate from experience. Yet the habit of me is strong, and suffering feeds on it. When criticism arises, the self feels attacked. When praise arises, the self feels inflated. When ignored, the self feels diminished. Life becomes a series of negotiations with invisible threats and rewards. Peace becomes conditional on how the self is treated. Much of our exhaustion comes from maintaining this construct, from constantly adjusting behavior to secure approval or avoid rejection, from replaying interactions long after they are over, searching for where the self was affirmed or undermined. We feed suffering every time we ask, what does this say about me? But what if experience does not require a narrator? What if sensations can arise and pass without being woven into a story of identity? This is not annihilation. It is relief. In moments of deep presence, watching the breath, listening to rain, walking without destination, the sense of self often softens, not because it is forced away, but because it is not needed. Experience flows without commentary, and in those moments, suffering loosens its grip. The tragedy is that we often overlook these moments or rush past them, returning quickly to the familiar tension of becoming someone. The Buddha did not ask us to destroy the self. He invited us to examine it, to see whether it is as solid, as necessary, as it appears, and in seeing clearly, to stop feeding the illusion that binds us. Another way suffering is fed is through comparison. The mind constantly measures better, worse, ahead, behind. Even spiritual life is not spared. We compare our calm to others' calm, our insight to others' insight. Practice becomes performance. The path becomes a race. Comparison is endless because it has no finish line. There will always be someone more advanced, more peaceful, more successful, and even when we appear to be ahead, fear of falling behind arises. Satisfaction becomes impossible. Comparison rests on a false assumption that life can be ranked, that worth can be measured externally, that inner freedom depends on outer position. When comparison is seen for what it is, a mental habit, not a truth, it loses some of its authority. The body relaxes, the heart softens, attention returns to what is actually here, rather than what is imagined elsewhere. Suffering also feeds on distraction. Not the simple distraction of entertainment, but the deeper distraction of avoiding direct contact with experience. We stay busy to avoid stillness. We fill silence to avoid listening. We consume endlessly to avoid feeling empty. But the emptiness we fear is not a void. It is openness. It is the absence of clutter. And when allowed, it becomes fertile ground for clarity and compassion. Stillness is not something to achieve. It is what remains when we stop running. This stopping can be frightening at first. Old emotions surface, unresolved grief, fear, loneliness. And so we return quickly to noise. But if we stay gently, with kindness, these emotions reveal they're impermanent. They move, they dissolve, they teach. We feed suffering when we refuse to stay with what arises, when we demand immediate relief rather than understanding, when we medicate every discomfort instead of listening. Listening does not mean indulging. It means allowing experience to speak without interruption. In this listening, wisdom grows naturally, not as information, but as intimacy with reality. Compassion is often misunderstood as something we give to others, but its first expression must be inward. Without self-compassion, insight becomes harsh. Awareness becomes judgment. Practice becomes another arena for self-criticism. We feed suffering when we turn understanding into another weapon against ourselves. When we notice a habit and say, I should know better. When we see attachment and say, I am failing. When we feel pain and say, I am weak. This language matters. The tone of the inner voice matters. For suffering is not only created by what happens, but by how we respond to what happens. True compassion does not excuse harmful behavior, but it understands its roots. It sees suffering as conditioned, not personal. And in seeing this, it responds with patience rather than punishment. When a child falls, we do not scold them for gravity. We help them stand. In the same way, when we fall into old patterns, compassion helps us stand again, without drama, without This kindness interrupts the cycle of feeding suffering. It creates space for choice. Choice does not mean control. It means responsiveness, the ability to pause before reacting, to feel the urge without obeying it, to notice the story forming without completing it. This pause is powerful. In it, suffering finds no fuel, the world will continue to present challenges. Loss will occur. Bodies will age. Plans will fail. None of this can be prevented, but the added layer of resistance, identification, and self-blame can be softened. And in that softening, life becomes livable, even beautiful. Freedom is not found in a life without difficulty, but in a heart that does not add unnecessary weight to difficulty. The Buddha compared suffering to being struck by two arrows. The first is the inevitable pain of life. The second is the mental reaction, the anger, fear, and resistance that follows. We cannot always avoid the first arrow, but we can learn not to shoot the second. This learning is not intellectual. It is embodied. It happens in moments of presence, in choosing to feel rather than flee, in choosing to understand rather than judge. Each time we notice suffering being fed and gently stop, we weaken the habit, slowly, patiently, like untangling a knot, not by pulling harder, but by loosening one strand at a time. There is no final victory, no permanent state, only a deepening intimacy with impermanence. And in that intimacy, a quiet joy arises. Not excitement, not bliss, but a steady ease, a trust in the flow of things. This ease is not dependent on conditions. It arises from non-clinging, from letting life be as it is without demanding it be otherwise. And in this letting be, compassion for others naturally grows. We see their struggles reflected in our own. We respond less with judgment, more with understanding, less with fixing, more with present. Suffering connects us, but only when we stop pretending we are separate from it. Suffering does not arrive by itself. It is shaped, sustained, and softened by how we meet life. This is not a burden of responsibility, but an invitation to freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom within it. The path is not somewhere else. It is here, in this breath, this sensation, this moment of listening. Each time you notice the feeding and choose to stop, even for a second, something shifts. The fire dims, the grip loosens. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be believed. Only if these reflections resonate, let them accompany you gently, like a quiet companion on the road. Return to them when the mind tightens, when suffering feels heavy. And if you wish to continue walking together, you are welcome to follow this channel, a place for stillness, inquiry, and remembering what has never been lost. May your seeing be gentle. May your heart be patient, and may suffering, no longer fed, find its natural end.